Every marketing leader I've ever talked to is dying to get to ROI. And for some of them, they're trying to be proactive because they know the conversation's coming up. Some marketing leaders, the heat's already on. And leadership is trying to understand, what is it that you guys are doing over there in your marketing department?
My name's Tom Baldwin. This is Overruled by Data, the podcast for law firms looking to start their data journey or accelerate the journey they're already on. Brought to you by Integrata.
There's an intersection in legal most people don't think about until something breaks, where marketing strategy meets data architecture. And more firms are quietly wrestling with the same question. What happens to marketing when the firm's data lives in a lakehouse instead of a stack of disconnected systems? Well, that's what we're going to dig in today. Data-driven marketing in big law as it actually exists. The real CRM landscape across the AmLaw 200, headless CRM, and how a marketing leader earns a seat at the table. My guest is the right person to unpack all of this. Jason Kennedy is the founder and CEO of Choate Frazier, which helps professional service marketing leaders scale their operations, technology, and analytics. Jason's been a CMO, a marketing ops director at Pillsbury, a consultant, and most recently, part of the data strategy team at Holland Knight, a marketer who can actually talk to IT, KM, and innovation in their own language. Jason, welcome to Overruled by Data.
Tom, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to get into this.
Yeah, this has been a topic that you and I have been talking about for a long time. So before we get into the meat of it, for our listeners, we always like to give folks an opportunity to kind of share their background, what shapes a lot of the conversation we're going to have. So in your kind of intersection here, your path runs from CMO to marketing ops to consultant, firm-wide data strategy at Holland Knight. What's the through line that connects all those chapters?
Yeah, good question. And, the CMO role was in accounting, so I was next door from a professional services perspective, but the struggle was the same. It was the struggle to show value. Defining ROI in professional services, where often your service delivery team is also your sales force. It's difficult in the best of times. And when it's not the best of times, there are a variety of pitfalls and open manhole covers that you can step in when it comes to trying to attribute the money you're spending and the effort you're putting in to go to market to actually what's coming in the door from a revenue perspective.
Open manhole covers, that's the right way to describe the things you want to avoid. And hopefully today we'll cover some of that. You've described your recent focus with your new business as the intersection of marketing and data. When did that intersection stop being a side interest and become sort of the whole point for you going forward?
So when I was at my first law firm, I went back to school to get my MBA, and one of the first classes I took was stats for business. I took statistics in undergrad, but it was theoretical, like just formulas, learn to do this. And it was awful. I hated it. I did stats for business in grad school, and it opened my third eye to what data can do for a business professional. And already being in a law firm, coming from an accounting firm, I felt like the gold rush in my mind. I was like, there is so much opportunity here that my own team, my peers, my previous firm, we're not unlocking with what's possible here. Now, I got out over my skis pretty early on because I wanted to boil the ocean. It was like statistical analysis and what levers pull to bring in what dollars. We're not quite there even today, 7-ish years later, but it put me on the path to figure out, okay, how can we do this in a way that it actually is effective, to go back to the ROI discussion that shows what the customer's telling us they want, all those fun things you can do with data. It was kind of the Wild West back pre-pandemic, and we're seeing some maturation over time, but that's really what got me started, was just the kind of Wild West view that was in front of me in professional services with marketing data.
So fast forward, you're at Holland Knight, you are the liaison between data strategy and marketing. Working in those two kind of intersection, what did that role teach you about how those two worlds talk together or fail to talk?
That role gave me like a crash course in data architecture, which is one of the reasons why I jumped in with that team. You may know H&K is one of the best teams doing this stuff right now. I put them up against anybody. And I got to ride shotgun along a lot of the early work the data strategy team was doing, including Lakehouse and vetting AI tools, all the cutting edge stuff. All the colleagues around me were working on those things. And it was fascinating. And one thing I realized pretty quickly is I've spent several years just trying to learn more about data. And I found out I still knew next to nothing compared to my colleagues in data strategy. And so for somebody who thought he knew something and realized, like, what's that gap look like for your typical legal marketer that hasn't been nerding out on data, for the last nearly 10 years. So, credit to Glenn and Emily over there at HEK. They built a team with true cross-functional backgrounds, IT, CI, KM, and marketing for myself and a couple other peers that already knew the lingo of those various departments that they were working with and could act as those natural translators as these larger initiatives got underway and these various departments got pulled in. I think that was a critical piece into making sure this was go as smoothly as it could for something of this size.
We always tell folks we talk to, if you want to see what good looks like for a do-it-yourself Lakehouse deployment, there is no better example than H&K. Spot on. So you mentioned a gap earlier. What made you decide to start Choate Frazier rather than stay in-house? What gaps were you seeing across firms that convinced you this advisory capability was a necessary thing?
Well, first, foremost, I love solving problems. Starting Choate Frazier allowed me to get back into solving problems, marketing, tech, ops, data with my peers, former customers, people I've worked with. It's a pretty tight ecosystem, as you know. So we know the problems. Everybody wears them on their sleeve. It's a rare benefit for this industry. Like, we're all pretty open about the problems we're trying to solve, our successes. Jumping back then, especially at a time where there's been a lot of consolidation on the service provider front. I mean, you and I both have experienced that firsthand. I think there's an opportunity for new, fresh perspectives to come in from the consulting side of things. So that's where Choate Frazier was born.
Amazing. So let's dive into some of the things that some of our viewers, particularly folks that are going to watch this coming from the marketing and BD background, that are just now still learning what a Lakehouse is. Let's do a quick version for the audience. In plain English, what is a data lakehouse architecture and why is the legal industry suddenly talking about it?
Here's my working definition, and I want you to pick it apart as the pro. But quickly, as I tell people, it's a repository holding one governed copy of the truth piped to every system across the firm. And why? It's evident in what I just described. One governed copy of the truth, that should get antennas up for every chief in the firm. They should know immediately the benefits of that compared to the problems they're dealing with today.
100%. I love that. It's a super easy way to explain it. I find that you have to use analogies sometimes to peel back the onion a layer or two. Kelly Whitnall gave me a great example and that I've run with a little bit. She said, having a Lakehouse is sort of like having Instacart deliver all the groceries for a meal to your front door. Sure, you could go to all these different grocery stores and buy everything, but that takes time and maybe you'll get it wrong. I just want to cook. I still have to cook the meal. I still have to prepare, I have to have the recipe, but I don't want to get all the ingredients. It's time consuming. I love that example because that's a thing that marketers deal with. They're having to go to HR for certain data, finance to some data. If CI doesn't live in their world, they've got to go to CI and the library, and something as simple as, a 360-degree view of a client. That report can take way too long. The plain language definition you create is perfect. Sometimes folks will interchange a lakehouse and a warehouse. People will say Fabric when they really just mean Power BI or whatever just lives in an Excel spreadsheet or a SharePoint list. How do you explain the differences?
Yeah, analogies is the way to go for sure, because for a lot of marketers getting into the architecture stuff, you can get some glazed over eyes pretty quickly. A question for you, because you helped me with this once, but the difference between Lakehouse and data lake. I get that question from marketers at times. When you get that kind of question, like, hey, I've heard about data lake, it's up on billboards and stuff like that. You're saying Lakehouse. What's the difference?
It is such a funny thing because the two terms sound almost identical. And I'll give you the clinical definition because at some point you have to just say it like it is and not sugarcoat it. So data lakes were invented almost 15, 16 years ago. And it was the first sort of way to handle big data that we were seeing back then for streaming and unstructured data, and the good way to apply AI and ML. But what the lake could not do that you could do in a warehouse, which is the house part of what we're about to talk about, warehouses are great for reporting and structured data. Lakes are great for unstructured data, streaming, AI, and ML, but they couldn't do the reporting part. So that sort of governed one source of truth that can power everything. You couldn't really do effectively from a lake. So the Lakehouse takes the best of a warehouse for reporting and the best of a lake for streaming and AI and ingestion. So you get the data capabilities of a lake and the reporting capabilities of a warehouse. It's like the two had a baby, and out came data lakehouse.
Nice. Okay. That's helpful. We need to clip that. I get that question a lot. I don't know if it's the single highest question I get like on this topic, but it's up there.
Okay, so we've just covered the differences between a data lake and a lake house. Why does all this matter to a marketer specifically as opposed to someone in finance or IT?
I think the biggest thing, and marketers may not realize it, is the typical hub for where marketing data comes in and out is the CRM, usually, right? Activities, mailing lists, maybe you're tracking opportunities in there, maybe even using it, doubling as an experience database, whatever that looks like. But the issue with traditional CRM is it effectively becomes a second copy of the truth, right? Which becomes a bear to manage over the long haul. Like you start to separate from what the actual source of truth is, right? Having something like Lakehouse where you've got something governed, the golden record, as you guys talk about, those sorts of things, that even though it's not like super sexy and it's something that's going to jump out right immediately at your typical marketer, being able to not have to deal with a lot of data quality questions or duplicate contact issues or mailing list malfeasance, all these typical like the various thorns in marketer side, a lot of it can be remediated or outright abolished with using something like this kind of architecture instead of what they've been doing in the past.
In our experience, I find that once the marketing and BD team kind of understands the power of the lakehouse, they become the biggest consumer of it. Because if you think about the kinds of queries that folks in those roles get, they don't actually own most of the data they need access to. They don't own the finance data, so they don't have kind of unfettered access to it. They don't own HR data. They may or may not own CI. They certainly likely don't own the library or any kind of news research. So they're always having to grab data. They're kind of waiting for everybody else to give them information. And from our standpoint, the real unlock for folks in these roles is that all that data that you are running around grabbing from other people is now readily available to you. It's governed. You know it's the right data. It's all been blessed by the right people. You can trust it. And that sort of frantic, oh my gosh, this partner's going on a pitch and forgot to tell me, and I need to pull everything together and I don't have enough time. All those fire drills that are never going to go away become more manageable. And so we find marketing and BD folks are oftentimes the biggest consumers once the thing gets up and running. Okay, switching gears here to kind of thinking about the state of being data-driven, what that looks like inside Big Law. What does being data-driven in marketing actually look like at a firm right now versus what gets talked about at conference panels with talking heads?
Yeah, in many cases, it's a night fight to get the data that you need to solve just ad hoc business problems, the stuff you just talked about, right? Like they would love to be a consumer, right? Because marketing's job is to read the tea leaves and make a recommendation, right? Like, what am I seeing in front of me? What is our captured market, our client base telling us? What is the addressable market writ large telling us? What do we have resource-wise? Let's match all that together and we've got a plan, right? With professional service marketing, it was the same in accounting. Getting access to a lot of key pieces of data, typically financial data, pricing data, that can be quite a chore. I've got my own hilarious stories of hitting brick walls trying to get that stuff in the past. And, try to find the objectives, no matter where they are or how small, you end up digging for objectives where you have the data so that you can actually report on its effectiveness. That's not a great way, feeling around in the dark, to show how marketing is contributing to the bottom line of the firm. But sometimes that's how we see these firms or these teams working, is saying, okay, I know that we got access to the data to answer X, Y, Z. So we'll talk about this. This will be on the front page of our annual marketing report. This will be, or we commit resources. We'll carve out, we'll bring in a third-party vendor platform to help us support this. And it becomes looking for whatever fire to put out instead of being truly strategic about how we should commit resources across the firm.
So next question on kind of data-driven state in marketing. You've mentioned several times Power BI is sort of proliferating. It's everywhere, but there's still a ton of spreadsheets working underneath. There's a ton of out-of-the-box reporting from individual siloed systems. Why do you think that's persisted? And also talk about why that's so inefficient.
Well, I think it's persistent because it's easy to get going. Most firms we work with, not all of them, have some level of Power BI access. Power BI desktop's free to download if you can actually get it, get it on your machine, get the IT blessing, and you're off and running. And the quickest way to get a dashboard off the ground is with 1, 2, 3 spreadsheets acting as your database tables underneath. So to go back to what we were just talking about, if you can't get access to a live feed or a particular view or whatever the case may be, if you can get an export, static export of that data, or maybe some related data that you can maybe draw some inferences from, but can't actually, point to directly, that's what you're going to do. Power BI gives you that ability because you have that access right there in front of you. It's wildly inefficient, but it's an ability to say we've got something versus fighting the usual, political battles to get access to the data that you actually need to report on effectiveness or ineffectiveness.
So speaking of political battles, is the problem mostly technology, process, or is it people and incentives? And when I say people and incentives, politics plays a big part in that.
Yeah, I think inertia is part of that. For a random CMO to go to their COO and say, hey, you know what? I could really use our pricing data, our leverage data, even just block billings across top X clients. I need that on the aggregate to do some real analysis. Some firms just say, okay, well, let's get going. Some firms, you got to have 100 meetings to get there. Some firms, the door shuts immediately in your face. I think that is the core of what we see. I mean, the technology is there. These are very advanced firms from a technology standpoint. They have access to the tools. And as we can see with our more innovative firms, they can hire in the resources to manage and build these tools within. So I don't think it's necessarily a people issue, definitely not a technology issue writ large yet. I think it is just that kind of legacy inertia that's like, this is mine. I will handle it. I'll run my reports. You go run your reports and leave me alone.
When you think about the gaps between what marketing leaders think their data can do and what it actually can do today, where do you think those exist?
I think the big thing, and we've talked a little bit about this already, is the ROI bit. So every marketing leader I've ever talked to is dying to get to ROI. And for some of them, they're trying to be proactive because they know the conversation's coming up. Some marketing leaders, the heat's already on. And leadership is trying to understand, what is it that you guys are doing over there in your marketing department? And so if you don't have a full picture of what your marketing efforts are doing, this goes all the way back to the beginning, right? Like your sales staff is also your service delivery folks. That gap right there between marketing and that model is where the ROI discussion breaks down traditionally. I think with the advent of Lakehouse architecture and being able to democratize a lot of this data with the right governance in place, you can close that gap enough that you can actually start to say, if not direct, pull this lever, we bring this many dollars in. At least you've got a general sense of these are the kind of activities we're doing to generate interest, which ultimately generates revenue, right? And for a typical legal marketing team, that's light years ahead of where they are today. So I think that's the dream state, is to get to the point where we can say, hey, look, these are the kinds of initiatives we need to be focusing on, where we need to be spending our money, because we know we have a greater chance of success over here on the other side, even if we don't have direct attribution yet.
Whenever I talk to firms, I often reference Heidi Gardner's work on data-driven cross-selling. And it's one of the best examples of, if you have all this data available, the things you can do from let me help you be more surgical on your go-to-market. Like, I was at a firm, I won't say which one, that we were convinced we could get more litigation work from JPMC because they were our biggest client, but they used us for one practice area. So the naive part of leadership thought, well, we have 50, let's just call it 15 practice areas. We're only doing 1 or 2 things. So that's a white space of 13. There's a lot of data that would suggest that maybe there's a reason why they only use you for 1 or 2 things, and you going down that path with them is going to yield, a bad outcome. Or I've got Coke and Pepsi down the surface. They look like they're the same. They're both $10 million clients. They're both the same level of profitability, let's say, but you dig down a layer and like Coke has more relationships. They attend more of our webinars. They come and meet with us in the office more often. We send and receive more email. We have more phone calls. We have more engagement. They pay their bills faster, as opposed to Pepsi that is, when you dig down a layer, all of a sudden you're like, well, yeah, I mean, if I have limited opportunities to take swings at cross-selling. I'm going to put more in Coke because underneath it shows us there's a greater chance, right, statistically, of getting that work. How do you see Heidi's work, or firms should lean into Heidi's work as they think about being more data-driven, showing ROI, showing value?
Yeah, Heidi talks a lot about that in Smart Collaboration, great book. And I think it's marketing has to be part of that discussion, has to be in the circle discussing that. And in today's world, so much of marketing's time is spent fighting inefficient battles, right? Like defending data quality or actually doing the admin work on keeping data right, stewardship, those sorts of things. It doesn't leave enough time for them to be strategic and to be proactive enough to reach across and say, hey, let me sit down with you and let's talk about this. I have this data. We have the relationship data. We have the partnership data. We have engagement data. We have, even if you want to pull in like, hey, we've got rolling 12, rolling 36 financials, we can pull this together and paint a really complete picture of what's going on with Coke and with Pepsi. And not only am I going to tell you why Coke's a good idea, I'm also going to tell you why Pepsi's a bad idea. Lawyers are very thirsty for that, even at the top ranks. But a lot of teams are locked up right now in just solving the day-to-day data problems. And if we can streamline a lot of that from an architecture standpoint, and if we can automate a lot of that stuff away, then you've got some resources starting to open up from the marketing side where they can be proactive to say, I see this is going on. We've seen some data, again, here in the tea leaves that we think is valuable. Let's sit down and talk about it. It's real hard to do that today.
Yeah, it's even harder if the right partner is pushing on you going to market with Pepsi. It's hard to say no because you don't have data to support a reason why. Like that last comment you made, I'm going to tell you why Pepsi's not a good use of time. It's very difficult to have that conversation with an influential partner when they're really pressing hard because they went to law school with the GC at Pepsi or something, right?
And you can say, the things I've counseled folks in previous engagements is sometimes you still lose that battle. Sometimes the partner wins and you have to go put that RFP together. But if you've got as much data as you could put together to say, hey, this isn't the right path, you've staked your claim, you made the case, you've got the data to back it up in case you're pressed. And if the answer still don't care, go do it, then that's what you got to do sometimes. But it's a lot easier than being like, I don't think we should. I don't have anything to back it up, but I don't think that's the right play. That doesn't get you anywhere.
Yeah. We just announced a connector for lead forensics, and someone asked me what the use cases were for that firm to use lead forensics. And one of the use cases they talked about was starting to get much better telemetry on, okay, the minute we submit an RFP, what's the traffic from that prospect or client like? And over time, can we start to see trends where we know we're going to win this RFP because statistically speaking, when a company visits the site a certain amount of time after the RFP is submitted, or they stay a certain length of time, or they make so many return visits, the indicators tell us that that amount of engagement likely is going to lead to a yes versus a no. Like that's a pretty interesting, very nuanced use case for website traffic data. I just thought that was fascinating that they went down to that level of depth.
There's a lead forensics competitor. I sat in on a call with them not long ago, and they pitched another very unique case where they said, hey, you know what, give us, a list of like 25 of your peer firms, and we'll log their IP addresses, and we'll start monitoring when those IPs hit your partners' pages on the website. And so after time, we have to see this happen, that churn out. We can start building like a lateral move kind of red flag, like with a certain level of statistical confidence. If an IP address from one firm hits X bio, X to Y number of times, then you got a greater than 80% chance that they're on the way out.
This is a great example where having a Lakehouse enriches that data tenfold. So we actually have another use case like that. And we fold in trending. Jason Kennedy has these kind of general month-to-month trends. He bills his time this fast. He opens this many matters. He comes into the office this often. He sends and receives this many emails. He adds this many documents to the document management system. If you see a drop in all those coupled with website traffic, all of a sudden it's a very strong indicator of something similar to like a client flight risk. Oh, this client's not paying their bills as fast. They're not opening as many matters. They're not attending our webinars as often. They're not coming to our website as often. It's a great example of where Lakehouse really takes a single data point and then supplements it with 10 more to just bolster whatever use case you have. You've got all that extra context to support a position.
And as a BD director, like instead of having to get that frantic email on Friday afternoon where it's like, big partners just announced they're leaving, we need to figure out what's going out the door with them, who can we call, and they spend their whole weekend putting together the playbook, like with some indicators ahead of time. You can say, I've got the playbook ready, I've got some pieces in play. If this is real, I've got the pieces already in place, so we can start moving kind of in motion and not doing a cold start when I get that frantic email from the practice leader.
So we've talked about some interesting use cases. Let's kind of dig into that a bit more. What's the CRM landscape look like across the AmLaw 200? You've pulled together some CRM distribution data on roughly 136 firms in the AmLaw 200. Without giving away the crown jewels, what does that landscape look like at a high level right now?
Yeah, so that's about 2/3 of the AmLaw 200. I mean, of those interactions, still roughly half the market. I mean, 30 years in, still the incumbent. Deal Cloud's claimed about another fifth of that group. The enterprise horizontal, Salesforce, which has, I think, at least two legal specific players now in Client Logic and Client Verse are out there in the place, as well as Salesforce out of the box. Dynamics, the same thing. You got Legal 360, you got Peppermint, you got Dynamics out of the box. So we kind of bunched all those together just to make it easier to read at a high level. So between those two, that's another fifth. Then you got your purpose-built newcomers, Nexel, Tree. They're small, but they're real. Lower small digits. Distribution, I think for Nexel, there's a couple HubSpot players. There's even, I know of a couple of firms in ML 200 that distinctly have no CRM. I think the middle 100, I think 50 to 150, you see a lot of those non-traditional players. Up in the top 50. It's your heavy hitters, right? It's Interaction, it's Deal Cloud, and probably Salesforce, not as much on the Dynamics side. It's changed a lot. I think I evaluated CRM in 2018, and it was kind of Salesforce, Deal Cloud, or Interaction. The fact that there's a lot more options out today, I think, is a boon for law firms, and there's always another one around the corner. So, I mean, ask me again tomorrow, there may be something else to talk about.
And as you look at firms as they go through that evaluation cycle, how are they actually sorting themselves across those different options?
Oh, that's a good question. So, sometimes it's based on vibes. What am I hearing? I've talked to my peers. I'm in my, CMO roundtables. They're using this. I mean, a lot of firms like to do peer modeling. Like, hey, here's our similar kind of profile firm. And that could be based on size, could be revenue, could be some other type of criteria, maybe leading practice areas or something along those lines. And they again, this is a very collegial business, and everybody is happy to trade ideas, and that happens a lot, particularly on the CRM front. So you hear trends, like, for example, for those like middle 100 that we talked about, a lot of folks are asking about Nexel. A lot of folks are asking about HubSpot. At the higher level, there's, the typical questions like, should we keep Interaction, go to cloud only? What's going on with Deal Cloud? And then the ever-present, we should really look at Salesforce, which is as loaded a question as it gets. It's a lot of looking over neighbors' fences, and I don't say that disparagingly. It's good to know that de-risks this a little bit, knowing that, like, you've got similar firms that do the same kind of work that seem to have found some success with a particular platform. That's a great anchor when you're a CMO trying to pitch, a six-figure change to your marketing committee.
It's interesting because these are big projects, whether you upgrade or migrate to a new platform. They're very expensive, and you mentioned ROI earlier, and there's lots of narrative around the ROI for CRM and how it's adopted. And then a couple firms that I've recently spoken with are looking at the option of going headless. So maybe you could talk to our listeners about that a little bit.
Well, if you could, I want to, from your perspective, because you told me about headless CRM. Define for us what headless CRM is from your perspective.
Headless systems are not, again, not a shock here. They're not new, but they're new to legal. The basic premise of a headless system is I have a very rich content layer, and I write my own UI on top of it, and that layer can be swapped out as needed, but the content and the data are the gold that kind of stays persistent. Going back to our food analogy, it's sort of like saying, I'm going to keep the kitchen the same, but maybe I switch from a fine dining experience to a different type of experience. And so the front of the house, I can swap out pretty easily, but the guts of the restaurant, the kitchen stays the same. We see that a lot in content management systems. There's many headless examples of that. And again, outside of legal, this is not a new thing. But the idea being that, hey, if I subscribe to the notion that most of the content I get is not going to be entered by users, and I'm getting it through, for CRM, I'm getting it through an ERM platform and some other data from other systems. If I have that data in one place, what am I using the front end for? It's reporting. Well, do I want to be bound by the reports that come from X system, or do I want to have more flexibility and write reports however I want? Chat with your data is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. Do I want to be bound by the AI native to an individual system? And then all of a sudden I have to have an AI tool for my experience system, my CRM system, all these other things. Or do I have my data in one place and I throw AI on top of it? Those are the conversations. And again, it's early days. I don't know any firms that have done it yet, but firms are thinking about it and talking about it, which is, I think, pretty cool.
Is this something that it could be built on top of Lakehouse architecture, or does it become like the integrated platform? Does it become part of the platform itself?
We would not build it. Firms would build that on their own using any number of different mechanisms to do that. That's kind of the cool thing about it is anything from like a replit front end, if you want to vibe code something, to if you had like hardcore developers, you want to write it in .NET or Svelte or something, if your firm's big enough to have that capability, you can build your own front ends. And more what's happening in the ecosystem, writing front ends now is not that big a deal anymore. And that's the part, actually, when you talk about vibe coding and things of that sort, the front end part is a little bit easier to scale than the back end data layer. That's where all the orchestration, security, governance, control, that's the thing that needs to be kind of enterprise grade. The front end stuff, as long as you've got single sign on, some other things, I'm not saying that's easy, but it's a lot less of a barrier to entry to have an enterprise or close to enterprise wide front end than back end. Where does a firm's CRM choice make the Lakehouse easier, and where does it make it harder?
Oh man, from putting my marketing user hat on and what I know of Lakehouse architecture, I don't see any big issues between one or the other. I mean, every one of these tools I know have some layer of API access at a bare minimum. But from your perspective on the architecture side, is there anything that you guys, in your experience, that you've seen that says that's a gotcha that we weren't expecting from the CRM side?
Yeah. We've got connectors to Interaction, Salesforce, Nexel, Dynamics, Foundation, a lot of tools that firms use. And the API, I think, just for firms that are thinking about this, you have to be cautious about extracting data via an API. Because there's throttling and rate limiting that happen that you don't think about. If your team is used to grabbing data from a SQL database, it's sort of, everybody understands and knows SQL, you can get at it, it's on-prem. Usually the entire schema is kind of available to you to look at and pull what you want out. With an API, you can have it chunked out over a bunch of different endpoints, and you have to have an endpoint for this, an endpoint for that. And the data you really want lives across a number of different endpoints. Some vendors today are actually kind of limiting the amount of data you can pull out of it. So the other big downside, unfortunately, with a lot of these new cloud products is you're not getting as much width of data from the API that you could from the legacy SQL system. And so firms are sort of thinking, my gosh, I'm paying all this money to move to the cloud with the intent of having more data available, and I'm actually getting less. I would say those are just considerations, not to say you shouldn't go to the cloud, but you have to be kind of thoughtful and do some research on the product you're buying and really dig into those questions around API and content access.
And we haven't even, it's not the core to what we're talking about today, but we haven't even really gotten into the AI bit of this, right? So how do we use AI to answer business questions, which if you're asking financials and time cards and those sorts of things, like a lot of firms are throwing, a few bucks here and there, right, at those kind of initiatives. But all of a sudden, when you've got to tie in stuff for like that last minute taxi report you brought up earlier, right? Or if you've got to throw some engagement data for an event that just popped off, marketing teams, most of them anyway, are not set up now where it's like, oh, that's something that we can run through a Harvey or even a Copilot or something like that. because we're not in there yet. We'll be the last ones in.
We could spend 2 hours on AI on lots of different topics. But the one thing I would say that along with data sprawl that we kind of let run rampant in legal and all these data silos, you're quickly going to see AI sprawl. I was talking with a CIO at a firm and he was looking at a cost management solution. I won't name what one it was, but just the AI add-on was like 70 grand a year. And he said, the problem with that is I've got 40 or 50 apps that kind of fall on the same size and scale as that cost management solution. And now I have to license each one because someone's going to want it. It's expensive when you aggregate it out. I don't have any visibility over like who can access what in each system. In the MarTech stack, you've got half a dozen at minimum big iron systems that are going to have their own AI tools. So all of a sudden you take 30 to 60 grand per application. And now I've got several $100,000 in siloed AI tools that don't talk to one another. So Jason, to your question, like most of the AI answers I want require data from more than one place. And it definitely, I'll just say very selfishly, it's one of the big, kind of drivers that firms are looking at putting a Lakehouse in place to solve for is I don't want a siloed, I already know what siloed data feels like. I don't want a siloed AI stack. And that's where the market's heading.
I think we're getting closer and closer. For my marketing brethren, this kind of architecture, a lot of folks have heard me talk about it. I think we're getting to that point where we can start looking at how marketing is influencing outcomes. Again, even if we're not direct attribution, which is the dream state, we're getting to the point where we can sit and say, hey, marketing is actually making an impact in these areas. Even if it's not a dollar for dollar kind of evaluation, we can at least say, especially come budget time, which is coming up soon, here's where we think we need to make some solid investment in technology, in people, in third party, whatever that looks like, because we know it's going to have an impact on what the firm's trying to achieve for next year and beyond.
I always like to end these with some practical advice for our listeners. A theme we constantly kind of revisit on our show is a lot of firms freeze up or they feel like their data is not good enough because they don't have the perfect data or data strategy before they do anything. For marketing leaders specifically, what would be your version of just get started?
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do, and I've had a lot of people ask me about this recently, is segment your data. Let's talk about just in the CRM context, right? Like my first firm, we had a CRM with 450,000 contacts in it, and we were dealing with data quality issues across all of them. We were trying to solve for relationship scores across all the contacts, and that was a chore, and we could never stay out ahead of it. But thinking about ways to cut up your contact data, like maybe just by job title, or maybe it's by top X clients. Maybe you're doing regional expansion, so you want to do based geographically. There's all sorts of different ways you can cut up your data to make it much more manageable, for data quality issues, for migration issues, for reporting, for analysis, for strategic issues, whatever that looks like. Finding ways to cut up your data. You can do that with a spreadsheet export. That's something you got to do immediately when you're done listening to this wonderful podcast, is get in there, get an export, pick some sort of criteria and start cutting it up.
So great segue. The concept of the Lakehouse sounds great. And I'm sure lots of folks look at it and go, that sounds awesome, but that's going to take a long time. Budget season's coming up. This is really probably something I won't even be able to take a peek at until next year. What's one small high impact thing they could do the next quarter to get better with their data?
It's a question I ask a lot in my engagements. Even in mid-year, it's okay to ask this question. What are you trying to achieve? What are your goals for the marketing department for this year? Not just, hey, better attorney service and, whatever. Like, what are the things you're being held accountable to as a CMO, as a marketing ops director, as a BD manager, whatever? And then find the data that helps you tell that story, right? And sometimes that story is not going to be good. I think that's something just as important. It's great to celebrate the wins and point at all the cool stuff, but it's just important in a leadership position to look and say, hey, we're trying to achieve this before the year's up. The data tells us that we're not doing so hot in that area. And that's just as powerful as the good news, because it allows you to see, okay, where are we falling short? And we've still got half a year left. Where can we make some adjustments? So look for that North Star. A lot of teams kind of get lost in the details. Find your North Star and then pull in the data that helps you tell the story about if you're headed in the right direction.
Great segue to the last question. So how do you advise leaders to balance those tactical wins against longer term platform plays so they don't end up with shelfware or stalled initiatives?
You have to evaluate and a continuous improvement. I mean, that sounds like real cliche stuff, but you can't be anchored to any of your tools, any of your processes, even like, especially today, even your skill sets. So understanding like, okay, we have this large initiative, CRM rollout, for instance, we've got these milestones in place. We're hitting these. This is great. We're moving along. But at the firm at large, we've got some other stuff going on that's kind of changing the direction of what we want to do strategically in marketing. So we need to sit, and it's okay to sit midstream and say, are we building this CRM tool to meet what the firm at large needs at this point? Do we need to stop and take a beat and reevaluate? Do we need to just change our implementation strategy? Do we need to change what data we're pulling in or what third-party data we need to bring in? There's a million questions that can kind of come up with that. But having the discipline to say constant evaluation, continuous self-improvement. Again, that sounds so cliche, but you boil that down to like an enterprise project rollout, that can save you a lot of grief in the long run.
Jason, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective today. For our listeners, I hope this conversation reinforces a theme we come back to often on Overruled by Data. You don't need a perfect strategy to begin. Start building your data foundation now and let the strategy grow alongside it. Make sure marketing has a seat at the table from day one. Well, that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed the conversation, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another one. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Overruled by Data.
That's a wrap for this episode of Overruled by Data. If this podcast resonated with you, if you took one or two things away from it, you want to hear more from law firm leaders that have been there and done that, hit the follow button.